Hey there, welcome back. In this module, I want to walk you through what it really means to contribute to open source projects on GitHub. My name is Peter Ditender. I'm a lead technical trainer here at Microsoft. I can imagine that many of you already use libraries or tools maintained by the open source community, but today we'll look at what happens behind the scenes, how these projects are structured, how contributions flow in, and how you as developer, just like you, can make meaningful improvements. Open source isn't just about grabbing code you find on the internet, or you writing code to make available to others. It's about learning from others, sharing insights, and really shaping software that the entire world may rely on. So as we go through this module, think about the tools that you use daily and imagine yourself helping drive their future direction. Before we begin contributing, it's important to understand what open source actually represents. So when we talk about open source, we refer to software that you can freely inspect, use, modify, and share because its source code is publicly available under a license that grants these rights. This openness gives rise to global collaboration where developers from all backgrounds work together to solve problems, improve functionality, and build tools that often become foundational across industries. In this module, I'll guide you through what defines an open source project, the common components you'll see in any repository, and the etiquette around contributing effectively. By the end of this module, I want you to feel confident navigating open source spaces. You'll understand how projects are organized, how to communicate with maintainers respectfully, and how to prepare contributions that align with a project's expectations. So whether you're fixing a bug, creating documentation, or proposing a new feature, these skills help you become a valuable community member. And even if your main work stays internal within your organization, many of these practices are the backbone of successful InnerSource programs as well. Now, what is open source, right? An open source project isn't just a public repository. It's a living, collaborative environment built around transparency and shared improvement. When a project is released under an open source license, it means the creators intentionally allow anyone to use code, build on it, or even fork it into a new direction. These licenses define what you're allowed to do and what obligations you have when redistributing changes. So as a contributor, understanding this licensing foundation helps you engage responsibly and ensures the project remains healthy and legally sound. Open source also thrives because the model encourages innovation. With developers constantly reviewing each other's work and proposing enhancements, projects evolve faster than many closed source alternatives. You'll also notice that openness leads to higher software quality. Bugs get caught more quickly, improvements are shared widely, and security benefits from more eyes examining the code. As a contributor, you're not just improving one project, but you're taking part in a culture of shared learning that can elevate your own development practices. Every open source repository includes a set of foundational documents, and understanding these helps you onboard quickly. The license file tells you exactly how the code can be used or can be modified. The README file acts as your entry point, explaining the real purpose of the project, how to get started, and where to go if you need help. The contributing file outlines the standards for how changes should be submitted, which tools to use, and how to run the project locally. And then finally, the code of conduct is to ensure the community remains respectful and inclusive, something that is essential in globally distributed teams. So when you begin exploring a new project, I recommend starting by reading these files thoroughly. They'll save you time by clarifying expectations, as well as preventing common mistakes like opening duplicate issues or submitting requests that don't really fit the project's priorities. They also give you that window into how the community actually functions. Some projects are formal and structured, while others are a lot more casual. Understanding the culture helps you tailor your contributions so they're well received and easy for maintainers to handle. Now let's talk about the actual workflow of contributing to an open source project. The first thing you usually do is forking the repository. This gives you your own copy where you can experiment freely without affecting the original project. And then from there, you clone your fork locally, you create a new branch for your work, and start implementing your changes. This branching step is important because it keeps your work clean and isolated, making it easy for maintainers to review. Once you've made your updates, you commit your changes with a clear message. You push the branch to your fork and open a pull request. This is where the actual collaboration begins. A pull request isn't just a code submission. It's really having that conversation. Maintainers may propose adjustments, ask clarifying questions, or provide insights that strengthen your contribution. So when you follow this workflow consistently, your changes integrate smoothly and you become a reliable member of that project contributor community. Before choosing a project to contribute to, I encourage you to spend time evaluating whether it's a good fit. Look for signs of ongoing activity, recent commits, open issues being managed, and maintainers engaging with contributors. Well-maintained documentation is another great indicator that the project really values clarity and community involvement. As a beginner, targeting issues labeled for newcomers can help you start with manageable tasks that build your confidence. It's also important to understand the project's expectations. Again, reading the already mentioned README file, contributing file, security guide, as well as the code of conduct helps you align your approach with the project's workflow. This preparation shows respect for the maintainer's time and heavily increases the likelihood that your contributions will get accepted. And also remember, communities appreciate contributors who show long-term interest, not just the quick drive-by submissions. So take time to get to know the ecosystem you're joining. Now, once you're familiar with the project, it's time to follow a predictable contribution workflow. The forking, branching, making changes, writing commits, and opening a pull request is really that backbone process of most open source collaboration. Maintaining this structure keeps things organized and ensures maintainers can efficiently evaluate your work. Clear communication through your commit messages and pull requests also helps others understand your reasoning and track the history of improvements. When you open issues or pull requests, aim to provide context, the motivation behind your suggestion, and steps to reproduce any bugs you're reporting. This level of detail allows maintainers to review your contribution without unnecessary back and forth. Always stay open for feedback. Maintainers often have a deep understanding of the project and may guide you toward more effective solutions. So treat feedback as a learning opportunity rather than criticism. Another aspect of open source is GitHub sponsors. GitHub sponsors adds an interesting dimension to open source by allowing individuals as well as organizations to financially support maintainers. Many developers dedicate countless hours to maintaining tools the world depends on, and sponsorship helps sustain that effort. As a creator, you can define sponsorship tiers, set up benefits, and share updates with your supporters. As a sponsor, you can choose recurring or one-time contributions, depending on your level of involvement. For contributors like yourself, understanding GitHub sponsors can help you appreciate the broader ecosystem. Successful open source isn't purely technical, since it's also shaped by the sustainability of the people who maintain it. Sponsorship encourages long-term project health and encourages maintainers to dedicate more time to improvements, documentation, and overall community support. It's a really powerful way to give back if a project has been especially valuable to your workflow. As you gain confidence, you may want to get more engaged with the broader community. One great way is to explore the contributors section of the repository, where you can see who's active and how they collaborate. Following organizations on GitHub helps you stay aware of updates, announcements, and maybe new projects they release. Participating in meetups, conferences, podcasts, or newsletters can widen your perspective and introduce you to emerging tools or best practices in that open source world. You may also begin thinking about how your own code could benefit others. GitHub Actions, for example, allows you to publish automation workflows that other developers can use to streamline their CI/CD or development tasks. If your project grows in popularity, think ahead about managing contributions, improving documentation, and also setting boundaries around your availability. Good maintainership includes clear expectations. So things like how often you respond, what types of contributions you welcome, and how others can get involved. All this brings me to my next demo, where I'm going to show you how to create a public repository, add essential open source documentation files, and choose the right licensing model for your project. These steps may seem a little bit administrative at first, but they're foundational for any healthy open source effort. By observing the workflow end-to-end, you'll understand how maintainers prepare a repository for community involvement. You'll also see how GitHub's interface supports these actions, making it easier to apply best practices, even if you're new to the repository management. The main goal of this demo is to give you confidence so you can replicate these steps in your own project. So, when we talk about open source, it's all about creating a repo with public visibility. If you watched any of the previous demos in the previous modules, I showed you how easy you could create a GitHub repo, private or public, out of VS Code. But for this one, I want to show you a little bit more straight from the GitHub portal. So I'm in my GitHub account. I navigate to repositories, and I'm going to click the new button, where I need to complete a few settings. Some of these are just optional, some of these are required. One of the first ones I'll highlight is the ownership. So what you have here is your GitHub account, because I'm the one creating it, but now we could also identify the organization, like the higher level, being the owner of the repo. And then underneath, you still need to talk about permissions, but we'll do that in our security topic. I need a repository name, and every now and then you can see here that GitHub is trying to help me a bit, like coming up with those super unique, interesting names. But if you want to make it a little bit more descriptive, a little bit more clear out of the repo title, what the project is about, then obviously you don't have to use any of those suggestions. Now, we had a website earlier called Demo Cats. So to please all the other pet friends, let's do Demo Dogs. And we would also provide a little description. Website demo app for dogs. Most important piece for the open source aspect of the demo is visibility public, which again means that everyone on the internet has access to everything in your repo. The source code, the documentation, the issues, the pull requests, like literally viewing everything. And then obviously they can also contribute to it. Next to that, a few additional options. You can select a template where the templates are coming from the organizations you have access to. In my case, I'm using my personal account, but it's linked to the Microsoft organization, actually out of being an employee and working a lot with DevOps and GitHub. Quite a lot of these are like Azure and .NET and DevOps related. So there's a long list of Azure templates. There's a long list of Microsoft templates. And the way it works is that the Microsoft organization here offers a repo, and inside that repo, they provide you templates. So I would recommend, I'm not going to use any of these for now, but I would recommend you, instead of like building everything from scratch, why not reusing an open source component? And that's also fitting in the topic we're talking about. It's optional to add a README file, but if you watch the presentation, you know that the README file is actually quite crucial and again considered important for that open source aspect of the repo. And we can make this easy. We're just going to create one. We get an empty README, so you still need to provide obviously your own documentation into it, but at least the README file markdown placeholder is there. Git ignore, we talked about it. So depending on what the repo will contain, is it code, then you would select the git ignore, and it has a long list of development frameworks where it's already having all the core settings for that framework, which should never be stored as part of the repo already in that git ignore file. Next to that, another crucial aspect, and I don't really know why this is not enforced as a required setting, because again, we're building a public repo. Like public visibility means open source, means that you typically have an open source license. There's a link here to the most common ones, if not all of them. And if you go like, how do I know like all the open source details and the differences? Well, you can navigate to opensource.org and then selecting the license option. And it's going to give you all the available open source licenses today. Some of these might be global, some of these are a little bit more specific to certain regions. So that's where obviously before creating the repo and allocating the license, the idea is to spend a bit of time in this open source website and really reading through and deciding which one gives you all the capabilities that you want to offer out of your open source project. Another good source to get started with what is open source is github.com/open-source, where they're going to explain like what's the GitHub's philosophy about supporting, contributing to open source with a lot of numbers. Like if you're considering, is this actually worthwhile to do, then hopefully those numbers can get you even more convinced. And then more specific links to what does it mean to be a contributor? What does it mean to be the project owner? Because each sides of the story have their own responsibilities. And then again, as we talked about in the presentation, you got an overview of the sponsorship for your organization. Again, on either side of the chain, you could become a sponsor, or you could obviously receive some sponsorship contributions as well. So back to the repo, I'm going to select the MIT license, not really meaning anything with it, but it's the one that I typically use for my open source projects. And that's pretty much everything we need to have from here. Once the repo got created, again, it's public, and I'll keep this one live for as long as we keep the training live. So whenever you watch this, you could always go back to it and maybe validating. It's pretty empty for now, but in the end, we still need to add some additional information into it. What do I mean by additional information? Well, remember from the presentation, I do have a README file. There's not too much in there, but I guess it's okay. We're now next to that. Out of selecting the MIT license, it created this license file. Inside the license file, it's literally picking up the official short version of the MIT statement. But we also talked about code of conduct. We talked about the contributions, and that's what I mean by adding some additional information into this. I'm going to show you one example because in the end, it's all about proper descriptions for each and every of those sections. But what if we're reusing another open source project to feed our own open source project? So one example, I'm going to reuse a little bit of my demo earlier, where I'm going to use the search option. Let me refresh my page. And we did a search for .NET, which on its own is actually an open source product. And we used the ASP.NET Core document website, or at least a GitHub repo for now. The files I'm talking about are basically these ones: code of conduct, contributing, the license file you already know, the README file, obviously we also already talked about it. Code of conduct, since this is like an official Microsoft open source, there's always a code of conduct, again, explaining like, hey, these are your responsibilities, but also the expectations. Try to behave, try to contribute, spend as much time as you can spend. If you promise something, you need to deliver. That's really what that code of conduct is about. In this case, there's not too much information right into that code of conduct file, but it's basically just a copy of what that official .NET Foundation, like the actual open source project, is already covering. So you can literally do that cross-linking. Now, why are we using the code of conduct file concept? Because there's another little trick that happens out of that. So if we use code of conduct and we use the contributing and we use the license, you're going to see that it nicely shows up here as well. So even without going too deep into the repo, you can immediately see like, okay, this is using the MIT license, which means basically everything in the repo is available for reuse for as much as you want. There is a short link to the code of conduct. There's an explanation on what it means to contribute. And then just to give you a different view, you have the same thing showing up here as well. So if you don't use those files, like literally using the syntax of those files, it's not going to show up using the shortcuts, using the icons. So that's the other part that I wanted to highlight. Next to that, since again it's open source, you can immediately validate and see who all the different contributors are. I'm not going to zoom in on any of those. That's obviously not the point of the demo, but just keep in mind that if you are the owner of the repo, maybe try to establish a little bit more of a communication, maybe better collaboration even with your contributors. So that's pretty much it on what it means to create your open source project. Now, we extensively talked and demoed about the concepts of open source. But before closing this module, let's have a look at a similar concept, but now called InnerSource. InnerSource takes most, if not all, principles of open source, but then apply them to your organization. So instead of exposing code publicly to the world, teams open their internal repositories to other colleagues across the company. This approach helps breaking down silos, reduces duplicate work, and also encourages shared ownership of reusable components. If you've ever needed code that another team already solved, inner sourcing makes discovering and reusing that work much easier. So as you adopt InnerSource, you'll follow many of the same practices you heard me talking about from the open source world. Provide descriptive repository names, clear README files, contribution guidelines, code owner files to route reviews, and providing templates that structure issues and pull requests. And then obviously permissions are also play a part. You can configure repositories to be public, to be private, or internal, depending on access needs. When done well, InnerSource creates an efficient, collaborative engineering culture that benefits the entire organization. And you could figure out that I got another little small demo for you, which shows how InnerSource comes to life in GitHub. We'll walk through creating private or internal repositories and preparing them to accept contributions from across your organization. Because again, InnerSource doesn't require external visibility, but it does require intentional design. So clear documentation, contribution workflows, and a structure that invites collaboration rather than locking it down. Then by the end of the demo, you'll see how GitHub helps streamline these practices so InnerSource becomes part of your normal development rhythm. So another little demo here, what it actually means to build about the same concept, but now using InnerSource compared to open source. Now you'll see if you watch the previous demo on open source, it's almost like 99% identical. So back in my account, navigating to repositories, selecting new, I still define myself as the owner or the organization again, why not? I'm going to call this the private demo repo. Demo for, let's say, private repo, maybe not super original. Where now obviously the most important piece is flipping from public to private. By the way, if you have a GitHub Enterprise on-prem environment or just GitHub Enterprise, you can also select internal, which also means that it's only your internal users from the organization or enterprise getting access to the project. From here, everything else is about the same. Now, I cannot assume that you watched the previous demo, so I'm not going to skip anything. I'm basically going to repeat some of that. So we have the private visibility. We still need to create a README. We could still add a git ignore file to identify which of the files in my repo do not want to synchronize into my repo. And interesting enough here, although it's an InnerSource project, technically we could still identify an open source license. Because what that means is that you create code, you create artifacts within your internal organization's project, but then maybe some of your colleagues want to reuse some of those artifacts outside of the internal project. And that's where this could be, again, quite important. I'm going to use my MIT license again just as an example, and that's pretty much it. Now, since it's a private repo, it means that now nobody basically has access. So what we need to do is go into settings, where we now need to identify collaborators. And again, we're highlighting here, it's a private repo, and you could always switch back from public to private and then private to public, because sometimes project natures are changing, where you could start like internal, not exposing anything yet, and then once your project, the code base is more solid, more publicly ready, you could say, you could actually switch from private to public, or the other way around, why not? And then most important here is managing access, where you can add people. And this depends a bit on your setup. Now, in my setup, it's my account. It's not linked to a specific organization, which means I can just search for pretty much anyone with a GitHub account. If it's a GitHub Enterprise setup with that internal visibility, you can only invite GitHub users, which are linked to your own enterprise. Another little piece of information that I wanted to share was more documentation. It's almost like training material from GitHub themselves on what it means to really navigate into InnerSource within your organization. And that would be this link, GitHub training, so pretty well emphasizing its training content, and then looking for InnerSource theory. I'm not going to walk you through everything of this, but it's basically like technically a GitHub Pages website, which, by the way, you could have discovered yourself because we talked about GitHub Pages. Anything that's github.io means it's a GitHub Pages hosted environment. And it's like an online manual, what it means to build InnerSource projects, what are the guidelines, what are the best practices, and I just wanted to share that. So with that, I think I can wrap it up and navigate back to the presentation. To wrap it up, you've learned the core building blocks of contributing to open source. You now understand what open source projects are, how to explore their structure, and how to start contributing using that fork and pull request workflow. You've also seen how effective guidelines, technical and social, ensure that contributions are clean, respectful, and aligned with the project's goals. We also looked at GitHub sponsors and InnerSource programs, which expand your contribution opportunities beyond code alone. So whether you're helping maintain an internal library or supporting a global open source project, these skills empower you to participate more effectively in collaborative engineering ecosystems. So my hope is that you leave this module not only with technical know-how, but also with the confidence to jump in and contribute wherever your curiosity takes you. Thank you once more for joining me in this module. Open source and inner source practices aren't just workflows. They're really cultures built around transparency, collaboration, and shared growth. So whether you decide to contribute code, write documentation, integrate automation workflows, or simply engage with the community, every action helps strengthening the ecosystem. Now remember, there are many ways to continue your learning journey. I encourage you to watch other videos in this course or search for your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn. Thank you for learning GitHub Foundations together with me. There are more GitHub features to discover. While the next module on Markdown might feel easy, I want to share more on what makes that syntax indeed easy, but yet also one of the most powerful and common tools to share information as well as documentation across most common applications today, not just being the default in GitHub. I'll see you back soon.